And we will send you the copy of this when we're done, so that you can preview it before we go live.
We may want to go ahead and cut out the alpha date announcement. We can go ahead and cut that one out.
Welcome to Disparate Worlds, where an irresistible force meets an immovable object. I'm Mox, and this is Sechari, and we're comparing and contrasting the worlds of Pantheon Rise of the Fallen and Ashes of Creation.
Yes, indeed, we are. Hello to you, friends. Welcome to Disparate Worlds, episode 13. Now putting the desperate in disparate.
Yes, we are.
Right.
Apparently everybody out there in the community thinks we're desperate.
Desperate Worlds, right. Well, I can see the mistake, but I hope it's not a foreshadowing of things to come.
Right.
Right? Like, you guys are terrible, I don't know.
Well, I think if we're terrible, this episode wouldn't be happening the way it's happening. It would be us just berating each other about these games. Instead, something cool happened.
Yes, something cool might have happened. I don't know how we suckered them into it, but this episode, poor Chris Joppa Perkins and David Nephele Beach. We always have to have their gamer names in there. By the way, I love that. I love that everyone in the company does that. They will have a gamer tag. It's kind of part of their persona. But they joined us for an interview that we were just able to do, and they were able to make fun of us, and it was quite effective.
It was great.
I'm, of course, just joking. They joined us for an in-depth interview. We wanted to do a follow-up after this last week's crafting and gathering live stream, and so we actually had some good information that we got out of them.
Right.
Stay tuned, and we'll get into it. First, the news.
Well, in the Pantheon world, we had what sparked all this, the live stream that was on Crafting and Gathering with Nephele, that happened on February the 4th, which was fantastic, and that was Joppa and Bendine and Nephele were all on there, and they just kind of rolled things out. Oh yeah, and Vernick, I shouldn't forget him. He was their guinea pig for everything. It was great. But it was a really cool stream, and it kind of rolled things out, like where the crafting system is now, Crafting and Gathering, and then it just so happened we had lined up an interview, and they said, hey, this is what we're going to be, rolling out now, so it worked out really well.
Absolutely.
And then on the very next day, the developer roundtable happened with CEO Chris Rowan, and he kind of had all kinds of cool tidbits, like their plan for alpha this year, the steps they need to go through to get there, and kind of laid them out. And I guess as long as things lay on track, that's the plan. Cool.
Absolutely, yeah.
Alpha.
A lot of good things coming. The news on the Ashes side, there's actually quite a stack of it. I'll try to get through it quickly. January the 29th, they did their January development update and environment footage live stream, so do check that out. We'll have that link. February 7th, Stephen Sharif appeared with the Ashen Forge podcast, so lots of good information there. They released, I love it when they do these videos, the tank preview. So we've had a couple of ones in the past, but this one's all on
it's 4 minutes of animations. It's really cool.
Yes, it's just different tank skills and the things that they can do. I was flirting with doing a tank. It's enticing me. We shall see.
Yeah.
And then the latest the cosmetics shop things went live. This one's called Lustrous Cordiality. Kind of a Valentine's theme for February, I suppose. But that is now live as well. So if you're interested in those cosmetics in the shop, by all means, go check those out. And then I'll let you do this one, Mox. This is the coolest ever. We had to cover this.
Yeah, the MMOGames on Twitter posted which game are you kind of most looking forward to, kind of poll out there, and the Ashes guys and the Pantheon guys kind of got involved, and I of course had to insinuate us into the middle of the conversation. Right. Hey, we hug it out over on Disparate Worlds, so check us out, kind of deal. And so it's good to see that the two companies respect each other and can have fun with each other. And even though they're in the same space, they're very different, catering really to different audiences. But I think you're still going to see a lot of crossover between people playing both of them, and they're not like, oh, they're bad. Even in our interview, you'll hear Joppa had nothing but nice things to say about the Ashes guys.
Yeah, it was very cool. It was just fun to see. I think what had happened was that Pantheon had been omitted from the set of 4, because I think you can only have 4 poll answers. And then somebody was like, hey, I think maybe it was one of the content creators was like, hey, Pantheon deserves a fair shake. So then MMOGames was like, okay, fine. You asked for it, here it is. Pantheon and Ashes of Creation. And everyone looked at us. And we were... I was like, I did claim, I was like, hey, you heard it here first, guys. So there you go. We made it happen. We'll claim responsibility for something we really did not do. So, very cool. All right, guys. Yes, we managed to juice out of poor Joppa and Nephele as much information as possible. Before we get into the interview, let me share a helpful link or two. We always do this. In case you want to dig deeper, follow as much as you can into the topic. We have linked before the Thorndeep interview that Thorndeep did with Nephele right around the time he got hired. We're going to link that again, so do check that out if you haven't. Good information. That was a good long interview there that they live streamed on Twitch. And then also, as we've mentioned, the February 4th live stream for the crafting and gathering that they did, just a regular Pantheon live stream. Latest information for the community. So do check that out as well. All right, you ready to get into this, Mox?
Hey, let's let the world see it.
Let's do it.
All right, so joining us today, graciously taking some time out of their busy schedules getting Pantheon up and off the ground, is Chris, Joppa Perkins, and Dave, a.k.a. Neph. They're here to talk about some crafting with us and maybe, try to drag a couple of nuggets out of them regarding the game. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be here. By the way, nuggets are a gathering thing.
Nuggets. Yes, like
I have to go get the nuggets. That's what you're. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm good at digging, so
you have to put some effort in.
So first thing we'd like to know from both of you guys. Tell us a little bit about yourselves. What's your gaming history? How did you come to find yourselves at Visionary Realms? And I guess that's kind of where we want to start off.
Kick us off, Neph.
I would say you want to go first?
Go for it.
Okay, so, all right, gaming history. So I started off when I was like 8 years old with an Atari 2600, just to give you an idea. But I think in terms of MMO, I actually got my start with a text-based MUD back in college in the 90s. Did that for a few years, and then suddenly there was this thing called Ultima Online that my coworker at the time told me I had to play. Turned out that Ultima Online was not my game. I mean, I gave it a good try, but then EverQuest came out, and I ended up going into EverQuest instead, which was much more my style of game. Did that for a few years, and then played a lot of games between then and now. As we were talking about before the recording, I played Star Wars Galaxies for a long time. Was very involved in that game. I spent 11 years in EVE Online. Don't ask me how that happened, but I did.
Accidentally, I imagine.
You go in, you start mining an asteroid, and then things just go. But
11 years have gone by.
Have I been on the same asteroid this whole time?
It's a very small asteroid now.
So did a lot of that. Played just about every major fantasy game that's been out there. Most recently, I'd say the most recent big fantasy game that I've played has been Final Fantasy 14 for pretty much the entirety of it since its relaunch. I've done all the big ones. I've done WoW, I've done Black Desert, I've done ESO. I've done all other games that I'm forgetting about. And in almost every one of them, I have been both an explorer and a crafter. So my big things are being able to get out there and see the entire world and uncover the map and find the secrets. Not necessarily about like doing hardcore raiding or anything like that, but more just learning all the lore and seeing all the stuff. If there's a part of the game that I haven't seen, that's where I want to go.
Yeah,
right?
That's an explorer type. I know one when I see one. Yeah,
Mhm.
because that's
And then
me
of
as
course, crafting. Like I love crafting. I do it in almost every game I play. Some games it's a lot more rewarding than others, but that's kind of my big deal. And as far as how I got involved with Pantheon, I got involved with Pantheon because I was talking about these things within the community, about how it was important to have gameplay that rewarded explorers and to make crafting a really integrated part of the game and not just like a side
well.
activity. And apparently, I opened my mouth enough time that the people decided that it would probably be good to work with me rather than just have me out there blabbing.
Right.
So that's how I came to be part of the team.
If they make you responsible for it, right, then it's got to go well.
That's, I put my money where my mouth is now,
Right.
right? I gotta actually deliver on some of these things. So
So
yeah.
now Joppa doesn't have to do all that stuff.
Yeah, that's
Well,
right.
actually, with our one of our game designers, Tim Wathen, was doing a lot of work on that. You know, thinking through some of the ideas. Actually, I think it was mainly Tim that connected with you, Neph, and then you guys kind of came to me and were like, "Hey, we got
It
an idea
was.
here."
Yeah, it was, and it you know I'm not sure if he realized what he was getting into when he reached out, but yeah, no, Tim was great. Tim's been great. He you know he Tim did a lot of work on encounter design and building out content within the game, and as he was doing that, he was thinking, hey, we need to make crafting a part of this. We need to make the non-combat gameplay a part of this too. That's what caused him to reach out to me.
Right.
He had a lot of amazing ideas that he'd come up with on his own, and so it started with me and him just sort of batting those ideas back and forth, and me kind of helping him refine the stuff that he wanted to do, and then eventually it turned into, hey, why don't you come and help us out with this?
Right.
So it was a really, really cool opportunity for me. I've been playing games for so many years, and now I get to help build one.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of one of the follow-up questions that we had was, because I imagine there's the world before you showed up, right? But Pantheon had its ideas, Joppa, I imagine, there's all of it's in progress, and you guys kind of have an idea. So what you want to do, some of those things are fleshed out, some of those aren't. And then, Neph, you step into the picture. And so I guess a follow-up question based on that was, well, what was the world previously? And then you stepped in, and how has your vision changed some of that and built on some of that to kind of send it maybe in a different direction?
So I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say we've really gone in a different direction, but it's more about fleshing out the ideas and the concepts that were there before. We're not a huge team. So we don't have the luxury of being super specialized, and sometimes that means is that we're all focused on something that's very important, and everything else is kind of waiting for us to get done with that.
Right.
And when I came into the team, by necessity, Tim hadn't really been able to think much about crafting for a while because it just, there were other things that were very important that needed to get done. And so what I was able to help do was to help sort of expand on the ideas that he was already pursuing and help him kind of dust off some of that stuff that he'd looked at before and think through it again and think about how could we really do this. And of course, I've brought my own ideas, and I rely on Chris and on other members of the team to help balance out my ideas as well. Like, I might have a great, awesome idea that I think is really, really cool, and then I bring it up in a design meeting, and they're like, "Wow, well, that sounds neat, but what about this? What about this?" Right? And so that back and forth that we all do as a team, that helps us sort of refine those ideas and polish them and get them to a place where we really feel good about them before we go put anything into the game at all.
Because everything is a moving target as well, right? Certain systems are getting fleshed out here, getting fleshed out there. And when you drop some change into that, well, there's the ripples, I imagine, right? Where, okay, well, we could do that, but that's going to affect this system in a certain way,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So
you have to think about how it ties back to everything else that you're doing. And that's one of the reasons why we're taking a very methodical approach with, what we develop and what we put into the game first. We know that there are underlying systems that have to be really solid before we can put in some of the things that are maybe a little bit more obvious to players. And so we have to be very careful that we build out that underlying framework so that when we do start doing things like building gameplay loops or, finalizing itemization or building out progression, that we don't have to go back and redesign something to support that.
Right, so it helps to keep in tune, in sync with each other as you go, definitely.
Oh yeah, we talk all the time. Probably too much. Chris is probably sick of talking to me this week.
Well, here he is doing another interview, so
yeah, there we go.
Can't
so,
stop
Chris,
it.
tell us a little bit about yourself. What what got you into gaming, and how'd you come to be at VR working on Pantheon?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to do the condensed version. I've answered this question before.
I don't doubt. Yeah.
I won't keep it too condensed, I guess. But as far as gaming background, if you've heard me talk enough, you know that I'm very inspired by first generation console games, things like Mega Man, Legend of Zelda, Mario, Metroid, these types of games.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the journeys that I've been on since I've been in VR is, what role do those games and those experiences and the things that marked me have to play in something like an MMO, where you would look at an MMO and say, there's, really not any crossover there. And yet you look at a game like Breath of the Wild, for example, and how just enjoyable it is to play. And it's a very different game in many ways, but it's also, there are fundamental things that are just universally true and sticky about games that we love, and especially when they're in that kind of fantasy adventure setting. But that's where it all began for me, and cool. I'm a pretty imaginative person. Like I live in my mind a lot, and so that around like kind of 8th, 9th grade was when EverQuest came out for me, and being able to take all that mental adventuring and imaginative ways of thinking, and actually for the first time kind of have that persistent shared world experience where I could become something like a paladin
right,
or a cleric, and live that expression and that be that persona. So that's really where it took root in me. By the time I found VR, I was looking kind of for the next thing for me. You guys, I don't know if you know or not, but I used to teach high school, and there's kind of a limit to where that ultimately goes. But part of what I was teaching was music, and had been a songwriter and a composer, and was looking for ways to kind of do that professionally. And I read a blog that talked about, if you're wanting to get into composing, to look for a video game studio that was at the right time in development. And it was literally this very serendipitous about week period from reading that blog, thinking about it, talking it over with my wife, and then going and checking a website on Brad McQuaid, because I had followed him a little bit from EverQuest into Vanguard. I'd kind of stopped following all that after Vanguard because that was a real big hit for me, disappointment. Yeah, and just hadn't checked in on him for a while, but again, very serendipitously, looked it up and found that Pantheon was this volunteer project. This was about probably 4 or 5 months after the initial team had split, and it was kind of a voluntary thing at that point. And was like, could this work? Like this game EverQuest that was so influential to be able to do anything related to that. And then, so as history goes, they let me write some music for the game. And my nature is I'm a cage rattler, and so when there's this weird mixture of like, okay, I'm writing music, but I'm also watching this game kind of be developed that is very close to my home in terms of what I know game-wise and what I love. But it's also in this era where I haven't played MMOs in a few years because I'm so tired and fed up with their sameness, and nothing was, I've played, again, don't need to go into the list of them, but, I've played deeply all the major MMOs that, we would all consider the mainstream MMOs that have come out since UO and EverQuest, and then some less mainstream ones. So it was this weird mixture of like jadedness and energy. Like here I am all of a sudden finding myself really close to the inside of this thing. I mean, I used to look at pictures of what was going on at Sigil. Like I would see like pictures online of, the people working on Vanguard and Sigil, and just think to myself, this is when I was like, 18, 19 years old, and I was like, how do you do something like that? Like, how do you it just seemed like a world away. And then, you know, here I am all of a sudden, like I'm here, like I'm doing this.
Doing
and
it,
so
yeah.
Crazy ambition started to creep in of like, what all could I do? And it was around 2015 or so that my relationship with Brad had been growing more and more, you know, a lot more touch points with him and just developing a friendship with him. And it was at that point that, you know, seeing my kind of passion, ambition in these things, and just a lot of the ideas that had been brewing is like literally sitting and thinking, what would it take for me to play an MMO again? What would it take for me to really, really be interested? Not just that old hook of like, it's an MMO and so I should play it, but genuinely interested. And a lot of the ideas that were birthed out of that were things that we discussed. And it was this really amazing experience of him basically saying like, you know, I want you to take the HLDD, the high level design document, and sit and, you know, think through like what does it need? Like what are we lacking? And for the first like 3 or 4 months of 2015 were spent working in, you know, a lot of the differentiating systems, things like the perception system, the climate atmospheres, the climbing framework, dispositions, and then some things that we haven't talked about yet that are still kind of dreams, and probably not for launch. But it's just been an amazing ride, and obviously some very significant challenges and painful things that have happened along the way. But we're here and we're marching ever onward. So
awesome. That's cool. I actually hadn't heard those stories before, so I'm glad to know them now.
Yeah, we're new. Hi. We're new to this. Yeah, I mean, we're just getting kind of brought into all of the stories and stuff, and are devouring everything that we can, you know, to learn stuff. But it's very cool. Like, you know, I had seen, especially the music, Joppa. I've seen this, and I'm like, is he writing this stuff? Is he composing this? And everywhere I look, it's like, no, this is him. And so I'm glad that you dropped that, because that's very cool, you know, very cool for me.
Thanks.
Yeah, our challenge now is finding someone that's as good at it as Joppa is to make some more.
Right.
There's plenty of people.
All right. So Neph, we have heard in the recent interviews, and I'm pretty sure you've answered this a number of times, but just for our benefit as well, can you give us a quick breakdown of the 6 crafting disciplines that we are currently aware of, and just kind of tell us what each one is responsible for?
Sure. So yeah, and I want to just put a big disclaimer on the front of this that as we get more systems into the game, and as we as these professions gain their identities, if you will, this may change. You know, we reserve the right to potentially, you know, break it apart a little bit more. But right now we're looking at 6 crafting professions. And I'll talk about what those are, and then I'll talk about how they'll evolve over time. So the first profession is blacksmith, which is pretty obvious. Blacksmith works with, you know, metal. So they're it's the stereotypical, you know, anvil and hammer and the forge. And they'll be making things like weapons and armor. They'll also potentially make some tools or some other things that are used by other professions. So that's pretty standard and straightforward. The next profession we have is outfitter. And you can think of outfitter right now as sort of a combination of like a tailor and a leather worker. So they're making goods out of cloth and leather. They do a lot of clothing, a lot of utility items. They also do some tools and other things that other professions use as well.
Is that where the bags will fall in?
At the moment, yes.
Okay.
That may change, but at the moment,
of course,
at the moment, yes. The next one we have is woodworker, and woodworker's a little bit interesting because on the surface, there's not a lot that you do with wood. You know, we tend to think of the classic fantasy tropes, like, you know, shields are metal and swords are metal, and bows and arrows are wood, right? But what else? But when you actually get down into it, there's a lot of things that you can do with wood from an adventuring perspective. So, historically speaking, a lot of shields were actually made of wood, and they might have a metal plate over. Over the top, but they're actually made of wood because, let's face it, metal's heavy.
Right.
Also things like spears, staves, even the halves of weapons, so the back part of the weapon or the handles and grips of weapons, a lot of those are made of wood. So woodworker is an area where we know we're going to have woodworkers, and we're constantly refining what it is that woodworkers will be able to make. But from an adventuring perspective, it's very much going to be about those wooden weapons or wooden parts of weapons or things like shields that they'll be able to do. And then down the road, there's a lot more that you can do with Woodworker if we potentially do some other things. But at least as a core, they're going to always have that sort of wooden weapon stuff to fall back on.
Do you see any kind of furniture and that kind of thing with woodworking, or are you thinking more along the lines of equipables and consumables?
More so long term, and probably post-launch, if we were to do something like a housing system, then I would see Woodworker being very heavily involved there.
Makes sense.
But that's definitely not something that we're really targeting right now, because that if we're going to do something like that, and this is true for any system that we talk about, if we're going to put something into the game, we really want to do it justice. We want to do it the right way. We don't want to just throw something in that's shallow or doesn't have a lot of engagement to it. So we're trying to be careful not to bite off more than we can chew. And we're just right now we're focused on supporting those adventuring professions and supporting other crafters and gatherers in the gameplay that they pursue. As far as consumables go, that's still something that we're looking at. What we don't want to do is create a situation where every profession has to create a bunch of different consumables, because that leads to a game that is just awash in different consumables, and that can be a little bit silly. But if there's something that makes sense to do, or something that we feel will really add value to the player experience, then we absolutely will do that. Okay, so we talked about blacksmith, outfitter, and woodworker. The next one on the list is jewel crafters. Jewel crafters are a little like blacksmiths in that they work with metal, but they're working with precious metals and precious stones and other semi-precious materials that they find throughout the world. And whereas the blacksmith is very much focused about pounding out things on the forge and sort of this large-scale construction, if you will, the jewel crafter is really focused on much more small-scale and intricate kind of activities. So, it's a lot different making like a diamond necklace than it is making a dagger. It's just a very different type of crafting, and so we wanted a profession that would focus more on those very intricate things. Right now, jewel crafter is going to be making a lot of our accessories, so rings, necklaces, masks, things along those lines. There may also be some special stuff that they create that we're not quite ready to talk about yet, but for the moment, the core of it is sort of those accessories that they create for people to use, as well as components that are used by other professions. So you're going to hear a common theme of, professions creating different components for each other, and that's a core part of our crafting system. So the next two professions that we have are actually focused on consumable items, and those are provisioners and alchemists. You can think of provisioner as food and drink, which is going to play a very big part in the game. I'm
sure the dwarves are happy.
Right? Oh yeah, you gotta have your ale, right?
Right, absolutely.
But food and drink are going to play a very important part in our game, with allowing players to handle or to set themselves up for situational effectiveness. For example, and this is just a very broad example, but let's say that you and your group are about to go into an area that has a cold climate, and that cold climate, is bad enough that there's going to be some detriments to operating in that climate. Potentially, you might have some acclimation that you've already done. You might have some items that help you with that climate, but you might also be able to get a special food or special drink that helps mitigate the effects of that climate a little bit, makes it easier for you and your party to do what you've gone there to do. That's just one example. There's a ton of other things that food and drink can do, but when we think about those sort of, that preparation for the encounters that you'll face and the places that you'll go, food and drink play a big part in that. Cool. Alchemist is focused on consumable items as well, but it makes things like potions and elixirs. So if you think about food and drink as something that you're getting in preparation for something, a potion or an elixir is something that you're using in reaction to an event. So the food and drink are for before you go in to fight the boss. The potion or the elixir are for while you're fighting the boss, right?
Well, one is like buffs and debuffs kind of a thing, right? Whereas the other one is more, definitely reactive. Like, oh my goodness, I need to heal.
Yeah, and that's not to say that there won't be some crossover where
Right.
maybe there will be some alchemy things that you do in advance to help give you some bonuses. Alchemy is also going to potentially make some things that are used by other crafting professions. You can imagine, for example, the leather worker who's making some special leather. Maybe he needs some alchemical reagents to tan that leather properly. So there's going to be some interdependency there, or some things that alchemists do outside of potions and elixirs. But when we think about the types of consumables, that's the split that we have is things that are used ahead of time and things that are used in the moment. And so the two professions are kind of focused around those things. And that is the 6 crafting professions. Joppa, I don't know if you wanted to comment on anything generally there, but that's how we see them right now.
No, strong foundation. Things that we would like to see each of them capable of doing down the road, as Neph alluded to. But it's about strong foundation and executing that well.
Cool. So I did promise
all about that.
Yes. So I did promise one other thing. These are a starting point, and like I said, we reserve the right to change them as we get further into things. But one of the things that we do want to do with our crafting professions is we want to allow players to specialize in some way. And we're still working out the details of that specialization and just how granular it's going to be. But at a basic level, if you think about a blacksmith, blacksmiths make a lot of different things. Does it make sense for a player to be able to say, hey, you know what? I really want to be a swordsmith and just focus on swords.
Right.
Or I really want to be an armor smith and just focus on plate armor. Or maybe I want to work on chain armor. So thinking about the different types of things that each profession can create and giving players a way to sort of focus what they do and at the same time gain some distinction from other crafters who are that profession as well. Maybe, Joppa decides to take up swordsmithing because he really likes making swords. And maybe I, as a blacksmith, say, you know what, I really like making plate armor, so I'm going to focus on that. And that gives us each kind of our own little niche. And that is helpful, not just for depth reasons, right? It's much more interesting to be able to do that. But it's also helpful for economic reasons. If we can allow players to differentiate themselves from each other, more players can operate in the economy. And that makes for a better experience for everybody.
This is a follow-up question on that. Will you be incentivizing people to specialize like that, do you think?
Well, I mean, it sort of is its own reward. So I'm not sure what you mean by incentivizing there.
I just don't know. Like, so here I am. I'm trying to be a crafter, right? And I can do the generalist thing. I can make, I guess as general as you can be is maybe the refiner side of things, and then you sell those components, right? Or you become a trader in those components, or you can follow it deep and really specialize and become the best, sword crafter, for instance, on the server. I just don't know if you were hoping for people to do the specialist route, or if you just don't care and you guys pick, whatever function you want to pick in that economy, go for it. Do you allow, I just didn't know if there was any thought behind that. So.
Yeah, a lot of that is going to depend on exactly how we implement this. Ultimately the system that we use to do specialization will, to some extent, influence how players approach it. I think the ideal is that players should have some freedom of choice. And if you really want to be that generalist, you should be able to continue to do that.
Right.
How viable that's going to be is going to be informed, at least in part, by the progression systems that we use. But at least as a goal, we don't want to force people to have to choose. Instead, what we want to do is we want to allow people we want to give people the option to where if you want to go really deep into something and maybe sacrifice some of your capabilities elsewhere, that you're still able to do that.
So like a specialized armor smith can make a sword, it just won't be as good as a specialized swordsmith would be able to make.
Yeah, that's more the way that we're looking. So you could still do it, right? Maybe you just don't know a specialized swordsmith, or you don't have one in your guild or whatever.
Right.
You can still do a good job of it, but that specialized swordsmith is just going to be able to go a little bit further than you would normally be able to.
Right.
Cool.
I think that's part of the question is there a way to incentivize players to not specialize? Is there anything that's advantageous about being a generalist,
right,
where you specialize? And that's just, like Neph has said many times, some of this will be, worked out in the design phase. So that's part of the design phase that is, still needing to be kind of buttoned up. But so much of this is kind of, I don't want to say contingent on, but so much of this is about getting it in the game. Like people think of design as it's like there's all these designs for a game that are written down somewhere, and they're just static, and they govern everything to the T.
Right.
All that we're doing, making the game, is just,
implementing, right? Yeah.
And copy and paste code, right?
And game design and game development is so iterative, now, and to the degree where I think most projects, I don't want to say most, I don't want to speak as if I have a finger on the pulse of the number or anything, but my gut would say that there are many that have failed, or the reason for their struggle is not finances, or not infighting, or any of the other things that can pop up, but it's literally not being able to manage the iteration, because it can roll on and roll on and roll on and roll on, and it's different from feature creep.
Right.
One of those terms that you hear people talking about a lot, and feature creep is very different from like iterating until it works, and iterating until it hits, and iterating until it's fun. Between iterating to the point where it hits and works and is fun, and just continuing to iterate because it's just, now you're just having fun as a designer. So there's a lot that goes into this and one of the things that made me think of this when we were talking about the specializing, and like, this blacksmith specializes in sword making, this one in armor smithing. Just one example of where iteration comes into play is that all sounds fine and good until you get into the game world, and you get into something like alpha, or later sessions of alpha or into beta, where you have more of a critical mass of players, and then you realize we've actually, by specializing and breaking down these trade skills into even further granular elements, now the ability for this player who's a sword maker who needs this piece by this other specialized player, is they're having a hard time getting together. They're having a hard time.
It's too segmented now, right?
It became too segmented. We didn't see that on paper, and so now we're not scrapping the system. We're just looking at data, and we're looking at trends, and we're doing this testing to determine, is this really the best direction to go, to try as best you can to balance holding up player choice and layers of complexity that are meaningful and fun with just the actual experience of playing the game and being able to get stuff done.
Yeah, cool. We have to be really careful, and like Chris said, it's a lot of iteration. We kind of put these broad strokes in first to give us a starting point, and then there's a lot of tweaking and tuning and minor adjustments and small things, sometimes even things that aren't even visible to players, just to make it finally land in the right place. And that applies to every system that we put in the game. It's not specific to crafting at all. Like, everything that we do, we have to go through that motion with. And from the outside looking in, you could say, well, how come you guys didn't think about this, or why is it this way?
Right.
But the reality is that so much of it is informed by what players do with the systems that we put in, that we have to gather that data, look at what the players are doing, and then adjust.
Sure.
And we have to do that multiple times.
It's almost like there's this design helix, right? Where what your idea is, and then you implement it, and then you then they play with it, and then you learn from it, and then you come back to that design. So you're constantly reiterating over it based on, well, here's this idea, and here's how reality has shaped it. Now we come back to where, we implement something new and see how that works, and there's just this ongoing helix of crazy.
I have a follow-up question to the whole 6 crafting professions. Some of these inherently, the items get removed as they're being used, such as alchemy and provisioning. I understand that there's not going to be any type of soul binding, or very limited soul binding, in Pantheon. Is that a correct understanding?
That is correct.
Okay, so how will you avoid flooding the market with low-level stuff, medium-level stuff as you head to the end game? Is there some method in which you guys are thinking about that will remove items from the game and make it so that that new person coming in that needs to level up crafting can now make that low-level sword and have it actually mean something?
Yeah, so that there's a lot in that question. Let me try to unpack it a little bit.
Okay.
So the first and most important thing to understand about items in Pantheon is that we're not locking into strict level bands like you might see in other games. So in a lot of other games, you know, you go make that copper sword, and then you graduate to making the iron sword, and then,
right?
you know, the mithril sword, and then whatever comes after that, right?
Yeah.
In Pantheon, while there will be different materials that you make swords out of, it's going to be a lot less about the level of the resulting weapon and more about the stats that you want to drive on that weapon. So do you want to emphasize a sword that's got really high damage? Okay. Or do you maybe want to emphasize a sword that's going to have a lot of stat bonuses to it? Or do you want to do something in between? And while there will be somewhat of a progression in terms of materials, you know, there's still going to be a lot of choice that you as a crafter will have to make along the way. And that kind of changes the paradigm a little bit from I'm turning out swords to progress to now I'm making the things that my friends, my guildmates, my customers might want to buy and use. So it really becomes about the individual item rather than, you know, than just simply trying to make your skill go higher. Another piece of that puzzle is that our crafting system overall is going to tend towards making those individual items rather than mass production. So while we're definitely sensitive to, you know, quality of life things, like we don't want someone to have to do the same thing over and over and over. We really want to focus that gameplay on making unique and distinct items instead of just turning out the same thing again and again.
Right.
When it comes to progression is not going to be about churning out lots of items. It's going to be a combination of things. You know, definitely creating items is going to help you with your progression for sure. But there are going to be other activities that you can pursue to progress as well. So there's going to be work that you can do for NPCs, which might involve creating items. There's going to be content out there that you can, as a player, can go out and participate in that's crafting and gathering related, and that will help you progress. There might even potentially be other things that you can do out in the world that will help you with progressing as a crafter that don't necessarily involve you sitting and spending 4 hours at your crafting station to do. Our goal, as with everything, is to give players options and meaningful choices, and let them pick the path that's most comfortable for them. But that will also help prevent people from flooding the economy with grind goods, as an example.
Right, absolutely.
And then the last piece of the puzzle here, like I said, this was a big topic, is the concept of scarcity. So in a lot of games, if you're working up that crafting, you know, you go out and you mine a bunch of copper or a bunch of iron or a bunch of whatever, and then you come back and you spend a few hours crafting with it, and then you just, you know, rinse, repeat, you do that again. The difference in Pantheon is going to be that, you know, some materials that you'll use will be fairly common and easy to get. You'll be able to go out, gather that wood or maybe that iron or whatever. But some of the other materials that you will need and want to make those distinct items are going to be things that are harder to find. And you're really going to have to go out there and look for them. You know, so you can stay in town. You can use the stuff that's easy to get. You can stay in town. You can turn out basic iron swords for the guards or whatever. And that's a totally viable thing that you can do. And there will be good reasons to do that. But if you want to really make that awesome sword for your adventuring buddy, that's going to require some investment on your part to go out and find or acquire the right materials to make that really nice sword for your friend, as opposed to just that generic iron sword that you would give to the NPC guard. So hopefully that helps kind of answer the question, but
it does.
You know, that's how we're really looking at setting things up to prevent people from just flooding the economy with lots of the same things.
Absolutely, because I imagine at some stage, you know, you may outgrow the sword. At least that's what I was thinking, right? You know, in the paradigm where I use a sword, but really there's diminishing returns using it as I level up, so I get a stronger sword. Well, it sounds like that's not what we're going to be doing here. We have a sword that can be used forever. It just stats very differently to a different sword that may, you know, be, you know, a specific kind of damage, for instance, or, you know,
there's a balance to it. I mean, there will be a progression in terms of equipment as you level up. So, you know, for example, if you're starting out as that blacksmith, you might make a sword to get you through your low levels of adventuring, you know, and at some point you'll decide, hey, I really want a better sword. Well, by then your skills may have progressed to the point where you can actually go make yourself a better sword.
Right.
So there will still be a progression, but it won't be as level banded as other games are. So in other games, you might know that you're going to pick a new sword up every 5 levels. In Pantheon,
Right.
it's going to be much more about, hey, you know what? My sword is it's not quite doing as much damage as I'd like it to do, and I think I could get a better one. I got this one 12 levels ago. It's time for a new one. It's going to be a much more organic decision instead of just being stratified like it is in other games.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there the kind of that classic the reasoning behind that, or kind of what constitutes an experience like that? So it's not that you would have a weapon that you use forever because that's how it's set up. It's more that by not respecting these strict level bands and creating this conveyor belt of progression and upgrading, you're able now to have opportunities both through crafting and adventuring to find and acquire weapons and armor that are actually very powerful and very effective, that can, because of what they are, exist through greater and greater level ranges.
Right.
So you don't want to upgrade it. You're super proud of it and super excited about it because you've found this thing. And I think that's one of the key things that I know. I mean, Neph has done a really good job of articulating these things, but it's also just the nature of communication where some of these little details can get lost that are so important to the what's being communicated. And one of those things is that when Neph's just now talking about the need to go out and acquire the resources to make these better, more effective things, he's not just talking about the traditional hopping from node to node to node and gathering metal and ore. He's talking about there's very much also an adventuring component to this, where to make this particular item, I need a drop from an NPC in a dungeon that's actually just as hard to get as the adventuring item itself. And so once I finally obtain that, I can go back and create this awesome item and have the agency then to shape it, here and there how I want. But it's a very I'm super excited about it. I'm just, full disclosure, like it's a system even back when Tim and Neph both were kind of sharing with me, and then more and more as it's developed, item identity is very important to me. It's a very deep conviction when we go back and we think about things like the Rubicite breastplate from EverQuest, or everything big and small, Ruby BP to bladed Thulian claws, and anywhere in between. Like, these items, we talk about them 20 years later, and we instantly know what we're talking about, and that's something that I really want to see return. So is this system potentially parasitic to that, where you have this agency to manipulate and control like the kind of items and their stats and things? Like, is anything going to be truly iconic? And I think part of the answer to yes, and what's made me really excited about it and settle it in my own heart and mind, is that it is to such a great degree tied to this adventuring sphere as well, where our crafters are capable of making incredible things, but it comes with just as much risk and just as much investment in going to these locations and doing these challenging things and engaging in this social kind of gameplay that to do so. And so I think for that reason, you're going to see a lot more iconicness to the crafting sphere, the items that it creates, and hopefully even approaching just as much as the adventuring sphere has enjoyed.
So basically, you're going to have a Whataburger secret recipe kind of deal going on, right? Or not Whataburger, it's In-N-Out, right? In-N-Out has the secret recipes. Like, that's cool.
Never know. But yeah, it's and the other part of it too is it allows us to sort of expand the scope of crafting. So just to use the example of looted items, there will be while there will certainly be standardized components and recipes and materials that you can easily get as a crafter without having to go adventure in dungeons or do raiding or anything like that, there will also be special components and special materials and even special recipes that you acquire through adventuring or through any other part of gameplay. So we haven't even talked about like potential tie-ins with the perception system. but you'll be able to acquire these things through other areas of gameplay. And so that will be the challenge for craft. I like to think about if you think about the way that stories are told about crafters in fantasy, it's never about they just, pick the iron up out of the barrel and make the legendary weapon on their forge. There's always a quest of some sort involved. Like they have to go get the ore from the dragon's lair, and then they have to go to the special forge high in the mountains,
right.
Under the full moon, and they have to do all these special things to make that really legendary item.
Right.
That's the kind of experience that we ultimately want crafters to have in Pantheon is, you can make those kind of more mundane and normal things, and those are maybe good for people starting out or for NPCs or whatever. But if you want to make that really awesome item, there's an investment that you have to make in terms of your time. You have to go on an adventure to go do that. And it's going to be a little bit of a paradigm shift from people who are used to crafting in other games, but we think it's actually going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to do a lot to make that crafting side of gameplay much more compelling, and also bring it into the social atmosphere that develops among adventuring parties and adventuring guilds.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I slip in a question here about molds? Because you spoke about molds in the recent live stream that you did, right? You get a mold or a schematic or some here's how you make this thing. And, I know you can put different things in there, right? And you would use copper or what, the subcomponents. Is there a tier of this or some degree to which something is so specialized and so legendary as a weapon that's a one-time use mold, and you have to then go get the mold again if you want to make another one, kind of a thing? Or at that stage, do you have the mold or the schematic that you can then use again, so long as you can reacquire those crafting materials?
So as it stands right now, and this is something that we'll look at and make sure that it really works, but right now, the idea is that all of those molds are actually consumed on use, even the basic ones that you might get.
That's what I wanted to hear. That's great. Yeah, absolutely.
We'll see how that works out in practice, right? We might make some tweaks here and there, but the idea is that molds serve two purposes. First of all, they sort of inform the crafting UI as to like what materials you need, so that you can, they act basically as a recipe item for what you're trying to make. But the other thing that they do for us is they serve as a way to limit the entry of those items into the game. So for the standard things that you find, like that King's Reach style shield or whatever that you get from the NPC merchant, they just serve as sort of a little bit of a money sink. But for things that are dropped or things that are found out in the world, or even special things that you might acquire through doing other content, it helps us sort of throttle the entry of those items into the game and to keep those things feeling rare and special. We don't want to create a situation, as an example, one of the things we do want to be able to do is have some racial or factional styles, and there would be specific molds or schematic items to support that. We don't want those things to be so common that they become trivial. Like we want them to still feel rare and special, whether we're talking about a year into the game or even 5 years down the road. And so having molds be consumed or having those schematic items be consumed is a big part of achieving that.
Right. I imagine on the back end, you can tweak, how the drop rates of things like this. There's too much of this out there. Let's scale it back some, and then you keep an eye on if it's becoming too rare that you can scale it up a little bit. And that's very good that you can.
Yeah, and there's options that we have, right? If we see that people are just constantly having to use something, we can make that one constant where they don't have to go buy it again or get it again and again. Likewise, we can do things like multiple uses, like maybe you get something and it's good for 5 uses before it goes away. So we have flexibility to be able to sort of hit the right spot for a good player experience. But it also helps us, like I said, helps us just control the entry of items into the game and make sure that something that's meant to be special really feels special.
You mentioned racial specific items. Along those lines, will there be any type of racial bonuses for crafting? Is that something you're considering, or would dwarves be able to make ale better in their home city than they would in Elven City because the elves are just
Don't
not
like beer.
as cool as dwarves?
So, I don't know, Joppa, if you want to take this one first, how you want to think about it?
I'll add. You go ahead.
Okay, so I'll give you I'll be honest with you. This is something that we actually haven't really approached yet.
Okay.
In terms of
design. So this is your vision as opposed to the VR stance. Gotcha.
Hearing this, right?
Yeah.
Take notes, Joppa.
so this is, we want the races to feel distinct, and part of that is absolutely having different crafted items or different things that they can make that are closely associated with a race. So, dwarven ale or elven wine or, ogre pickles or whatever, right?
Ogre pickles, love it.
Ogre pickles. So we want there to be these things that are very closely associated with a race, or even potentially with a faction. So maybe we're not even talking about a race, right? We're talking about a faction or a group of NPCs out, or like an NPC race. Like there's all these different possibilities. My personal opinion is that rather than restrict those things and say you have to be a dwarf to create dwarven ale, what I would rather do is allow people to, after proving themselves to that race or faction or group, then allow them to learn those recipes so that, maybe you started
off... tying the faction system now into crafting. Oh, that's slick.
So maybe you started off as an ogre. And you decided that you want your ogre to be able to brew dwarven ale. Well, the dwarves don't really like the ogres too much, so you're going to have to earn some trust there.
Right.
You're going to have to do some things to prove yourselves. And then eventually, if you do enough, those dwarven brewmasters will teach you the secrets of dwarven ale. But that's sort of the stance that I take, is I want it to be more associated with things that you do in the world than just the race that you chose at character creation.
I hear it's a little known fact that ogres love, the dwarves love ogre pickles, so that might help.
You never know. Maybe you have to trade those ogre pickles for some dwarven ale.
This economy is coming into it now. Everything's great here. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So one of the questions that we had for you guys is this idea of theory crafters, right? That there is a player tendency always to calculate the best in slots. So and I gotta imagine this is gonna be the bane to your existence to some degree. A player's gonna get in there, gonna math this thing out. Okay, here, and it's gonna become common quote unquote conventional knowledge, right? The best thing that you can do is have an X sword with this damage, blah blah blah, and it gets out there.
And here's the recipe.
And here's where you go to get the recipe. So the players are always trying to find the most efficient, effective method out there. And I know that your vision has been more one of diversity, right? Build a diversity. You choose and you can do things differently. So we were wanting to ask you, how are you thinking? What's your approach to combating that in a way, allowing people to do that, but still, promoting that diversity and incentivizing people to do different things rather than to just kind of get into like a conventional understanding narrowness?
So I'll start. I think Joppa's probably got some thoughts on this as well, but to me, diversity is achieved through meaningful choices. So if we're building things in such a way where there's only one best option, then we've already failed at achieving diversity.
Right.
What we have to do there is we have to make sure that there are enough choices for players, within their adventuring class or whatever, that there can be that diversity, that it can exist, that there have to be forks in the road where players choose to go one way or another. And that's so that the core to achieving that diversity is having those choices. From a crafting perspective, we want to set the system up to support those choices so that you are able to make those choices, but the viability of those choices actually comes down to the way that we set up adventuring. And this is where I'll actually hand it over to Joppa, because I know he has thoughts on this.
All right.
Yeah, well, I mean, best in slot exists only in as much as there's a way to kind of uniformly position yourself as optimally effective, against any situation in any context. That's typically where you end up with a best in slot syndrome. So if I'm a wizard and the only stats that matter in every situation to me are intelligence and stamina, let's say, and NPCs are primarily, only there to soak up damage from me. Like I don't have anything else to really do as a wizard, and NPCs don't have anything else they're really doing except soaking damage. Then you move further and further into like a best in slot syndrome.
You get herded into that almost. Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's an even better word. You are literally designed into that, and however many different handholds and grips and levers and knobs you build into the design of these things is the degree to which you can get away from best in slot or just further into it. So for Pantheon, there's several layers of complexity that I'm not going to say there's not going to be some best in slot items, but it's going to be much more. It's going to be as much as we can decentralized and kind of moved more into. It depends on what you're wanting to do in the situation. So is there a best in slot, staff that a wizard will have? Probably not, in the sense that it's not going to be best in slot for every situation that you're dealing with. Now, here are some of the specific layers that contribute to that. Number one, you have a base attribute system that's extremely potent. Every point of attribute in Pantheon is comparatively to, typically in other MMOs, we swing much more to weighting our attributes much heavier, as opposed to letting level do the majority of the work, and then attributes are kind of there to 25% or so. Our attributes are much more potent than that. In addition to that, our attributes are manifold, and so there are 2-3 different things that each attribute. Constitution is doing, agility is doing, intelligence is doing. We've also made the attributes mutually desirable. So, for example, a wizard isn't going to just want intelligence. Intelligence is providing spell power and mana primarily, but wisdom is governing spell critical hit. And so you're kind of seeing these multiple attributes that are mutually desirable. But then even further than that, you have your ability arsenal, and your abilities actually are set up to benefit uniquely from specific stats. So a wizard, for example, their fire line their fire spells could be amplified by strength, because there's something to just the force with which you're pushing these things out, that you're actually seeing wizards that are speccing a little more into strength on purpose, not because they need it for melee damage, but because it's actually benefiting their fire.
Incredible.
That's really neat.
Yeah.
So rather than seeing like a kind of like a typical D&D characters built, like where you have low high, and then so you've got much more of a bell curve maybe of stats.
Yeah, I absolutely expect to see that, especially. But like I said, it's even that it's not a static thing where I choose kind of my focus and that's my bell curve. But it's more like, okay, what NPCs am I fighting? What specific dispositions do they have? Let's say. So all of a sudden I find myself in a situation where I'm fighting a predator NPC, or I'm fighting a mastermind disposition NPC, and all of a sudden I have to totally rethink my loadout and what I'm bringing into that battle, because this NPC is not going to respond or be affected in the same way. And so therefore, what stats do I need to be most effective for this specific? When you factor in the environmental effects, the climate, the atmospheres, and the dispositions, and kind of all these different layers that I've just described, it's not that you're doing away with the idea that there's a combination of stats on a particular item that are just the best in a sense. But it's the best for what, and the best win, and that's kind of more where we're trying to lean towards.
So there is a best in slot. It's just more situational, I think, right? Like if we're fighting this specific disposition in this specific area, and this is the what I want to use. So I probably have a collection, I imagine, of weapons or things that would, stretch that, kind of spread that out. That's interesting.
Pride, as a character, that I've amassed all of these different highly effective solutions, to these different situations.
Sure.
So in the co-stream, we got to see the pyrophobic spiders, disposition. Is disposition limited to normal mobs, or will boss mobs also have dispositions?
They will have their own. So when we're talking about a normal mob, we're calling it dispositions.
Okay.
Bosses, we call it manifestation, but we don't typically say that like out in the air because it can just get confusing. So the disposition system, yes, it will apply to NPCs, but also to bosses. And the cool thing about it is when it applies to bosses, and that means everything from a mini boss in a dungeon all the way up to premier raid content. If you happen to stumble upon a premier raid boss that has a manifestation, that's not only going to dramatically affect that fight, but it's also going to dramatically affect the loot table and the things that you have the potential to get from that fight. So
awesome.
It's something that you're hoping for and hunting for in some cases, if you can handle it, because it opens up a whole new loot table.
Right.
I just wanted to call out, so everything that Joppa just described to you is also why consumables in our game are so important,
right,
even at lower levels. In a lot of games, consumables just don't get used until high level rating. But you can imagine that you're in an area exploring at the lower or the mid levels, and you come across an encounter or a set of NPCs that you need to sort of change for. Well, you maybe don't have a bag full of equipment that you can you can change up, but if you've got a provisioner handy, maybe they can whip up some food that's going to help you with that fight or help you with that group of NPCs. The other thing that I think is very important to realize about this is that while there's going to be a benefit to specializing towards that best in slot for given encounters, we're not always going to theme areas specifically towards one situation or another. So when you're playing through that content, you may find a mix of different enemies and different dispositions that need different approaches. And sometimes it may benefit you to sort of play the generalist role and to say, you know what, I'm not going to focus too much one way or the other because I need to be able to rapidly change my tactics. So it makes for a lot of really interesting choices in character development that ultimately we think are much more engaging for players. You start to care a lot more about what you have and what you can use and how you can use it, instead of just always following whatever the optimal solution is.
Right. Cool. Well, I'd love to move into gathering before we wrap this up. One of the things I'm concerned about, and after your stream the other day, it was kind of out there in the community, was having to switch out my weapon for my gathering tool. How practical is that in reality? Like when you have to put your sword away and gather something, if I get attacked by something, will I be able to put my weapon back on? Or once I'm locked in combat, then I'm fighting with
your pickaxe,
scissors.
Your scissors.
With your sickle, yeah. So I'll start off by saying, what you saw in the stream the other day was obviously very, very early. There's a lot of UI work that we still need to do.
Of course.
And that applies to everything. So, I think of the idea of being able to swap into a gathering tool without having to go into your inventory and drag it over, that's a quality of life thing that will come much later when we get the UI all set up.
Okay.
I will say that we do want there to be a risk to gathering. We don't want players to simply be able to run up and click on a node with impunity and then immediately switch back to their adventuring loadout if a wolf comes by and starts chomping on their leg or whatever. So we do want there to be some risk to gathering. That is on purpose. A lot of the gathering activities that you have outside of the basics, there will be gathering activities that actually occur in dangerous areas where you'll want some protection. You'll want some friends with you to watch your back while you're getting that exotic material that you need for your crafting. So we want that to be a thing, and as a result of that, there's going to be limits on what we allow you to do in terms of switching during the gathering interaction. If you start mining on that ore node or you start chopping down that tree and that wolf comes along, you might be confined to your woodcutting axe or your mining pick until you can either break away enough to be able to switch, or until somebody can pull that wolf off of you long enough to let you change up. So we're not going to go the route of just allowing you to switch back and forth freely at will.
Okay.
But we are going to be very sensitive to providing a fun experience for players. And, definitely we don't want you to have to go hunt through your bag every time, to pull the right tool into your main hand slot. So there will be something there. It's way too early for us to put that in yet. And that's why you didn't see it in the stream.
So what I'm hearing right now is that I want to have a little bit of fire damage on my flower clipping shears, right? You never know when you have to fight off a wolf. So
if you're harvesting in a very cold environment, you may actually need that too.
Right.
That's the other thing when we talk about gathering. Like, we tend to think of gathering based on what we've done in other games, where we run around, we follow a loop, and we hit the nodes on that loop or whatever, right? Gathering in Pantheon is going to be a little bit different, just because the environment matters so much more. So if you're out there looking for those gathering nodes, well, you have to think about, maybe the gathering node's at the top of the thing that I have to climb,
right?
Or maybe it's down underwater.
Outcropping, the very little outcropping that I have to climb with these things swooping around.
Yeah, and then you have to think about, well, what about extreme climates, right? I'm after this exotic material, but you know what? It only shows up in scorching climates. And now I have to be prepared to handle that climate to be able to gather this material.
In my plate metal armor.
Yeah, so the environment matters a lot more in Pantheon than it does in other games, and that applies to gathering just as much as to combat.
So,
important
storage space.
Quality of life. We are very friendly towards quality of life. Quality of life is a good thing. So, whether it be like one of the comments that you guys had about, the comparative tooltips, or things like the what we were just discussing, and there's so many other things, even just, there's polish and there's quality of life, and both things are very important and ongoing. So just as a general disclaimer, to keep that in mind when you see, a mining animation that looks kind of clunky, or you see like he's mining with his torch in his hand, or even things where you're like, this has just become a staple. Just because we don't have it doesn't mean it's like this hard line,
Right, and the game's not coming out tomorrow.
Right.
We have tried desperately to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we cut that alpha launch date, so...
Yeah.
Sorry. We're really sensitive to that. We want the experience to be a good one for players, and a lot of those quality of life type things will come in as we get our UI finalized, and as we get the game systems to a state where they're mostly finalized. It's just when you see the streaming that we do right now, because we're pre-alpha, it's very raw, it's very unfinished, and you just have to sort of keep that in mind.
Storage space, that as we're kind of out there adventuring, obviously mining ore is heavier. You guys mentioned that encumbrance is going to be a thing, and travel is going to be difficult. So if I'm picking flowers versus mining ore, is there going to be a balance in those things as far as storage space and weight and things like that?
So the short answer is yes. There are two ways that you control how much somebody can carry in a slot-based inventory system like we have. One is the weight of the items. The other is the stack size of the items. So, for example, if you're out there mining ore or even chopping down trees for lumber, both the results of that are pretty heavy. And you may only be able to carry a few of those things before you start to feel the effects of encumbrance. That's on purpose for two reasons. The first reason is that we don't necessarily want to encourage people to hoard a bunch of these things. We want you to be, we want people working with smaller quantities instead of, massive piles of resources. So that's the first reason. The second reason is we also want, again, to focus people on acquiring the distinct resources that they need instead of, I'm going to go harvest iron for 3 hours straight, So that's one of the reasons we do that. But when it comes to things like harvested plants or maybe fish or, food ingredients that you get, where we control that is not necessarily with weight, but with the stack size. So if, let's say you're out there harvesting cotton to make cloth, it takes volume wise, it takes a lot of cotton to actually spin and make a cloth out of. Now we're not going to make you harvest cotton like 50 times and then come back and turn, and refine that into like 5 squares of cloth. That would be silly. But when you harvest that cotton plant and you get that bale of cotton, that's going to take up a fair amount of volume, and that's reflected in the stack size. So things like that will have a low stack size. In terms of storage in general, storage is an area that we're very sensitive to. What we're trying to achieve is to make it meaningful without making it restrictive on players. So, we don't want people to have a terrible experience. We want them to feel like they have enough space to do what they need to do. But we also want to encourage players to have to pay attention to it. It can't just be that you have a bottomless bag that everything goes into. So there's a balance that we're trying to strike there. And that's something that we'll be looking at very closely, and we'll be doing a lot of tuning on as more and more of the game gets put into place to make sure that we hit that balance really well.
Will there be weight reduction bags?
Broadly, yes. Broadly, yes.
They're your favorite thing.
Yeah. Joppa, I don't know if you wanted to go say something there, but my stance on
thing, right? Weight reduction bags.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So my stance on weight reduction is that it's a good thing to have. However, it can go too far.
Right. You don't want a bag that holds everything and doesn't weigh anything.
Yeah. So it's something where we have to be careful. And that comes back to the tuning aspect, right?
Something like a small weight reduction bag that can hold a few pieces of ore that will allow you to continue adventuring, as opposed to have to go back. But you can't put anything else in it but those 4 pieces of ore, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to be careful with it. We want to apply it sparingly. What we don't want is a situation where 3 years after launch, everybody's running around with like 85% weight reduction bags and nobody cares about encumbrance anymore.
Right.
So yeah, it's just an area where we're going to be very cautious as we implement. And truthfully, we're probably going to try to keep it a little bit rare. We want it to be special when you get that weight reduction bag. So
makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So I think the only other question that we probably wanted to ask about is the cost of failure. So I know there was the joke of exploding forges, right? Oh, boom! I messed this one up. So I think this one is more specifically around. I've gone out there. I've paid the price to go get this element, right? It is something I need to craft in this recipe. Now, if there's an RNG element and I happen to fail, do I lose that element that I've worked hard to get? Is that the risk involved?
Specifically leaning back towards the EverQuest, like Coldane, Prayer Shawl, like all those rare stuff you needed to farm and then had the chance to fail on. Like, is that going to be a thing?
Yeah, so honestly, it's still kind of TBD. I will say that I'm in favor of having a risk of failure in general. But I also don't want to penalize a player who's just spent the last 3 weeks gathering materials to make something really special and just happens to get a bad, result on their crafting attempt. So what you'll probably see is that there will be a general risk of failure. However, in certain cases, we may actually prevent those items from being destroyed just because we don't want to penalize players that harshly. And it's it's going to be very situational. It's going to depend on what it is you're trying to create, where you are. If you're doing something, it may also depend on your skill, right? If you're doing something that you're really just not ready to do, there may be a higher penalty on that. But it's all still TBD. Like, we haven't quite worked that out yet. From an implementation perspective, we want to get the base system in first that allows you to create the items. And then we can start to evaluate where is it appropriate to put that risk in.
Cool. Well, I want to thank you guys both for joining us. This has been super, interesting, and I'm looking forward to the progression of Pantheon.
Yes, absolutely. And please, for the interim, if we are overly harsh in thinking through something, in reviewing something, by all means, feel free to set us straight. We're more than excited to have good information out there.
Right.
You guys have done a really excellent job, and part of my excitement for coming on the show is just as a way, in our way, to say thanks. For the coverage and the care and the thought and the time you guys put in to watch and listen and learn. And I think even in the critiquing, critiquing is good. It's really so. It's never anything that you need to shy away from or tiptoe around. And it garners a lot of respect from us, to hear a very objective approach. We're I know you guys do coverage for Ashes as well, and we're excited about Ashes, and I'm a fan of Stevens, and I have respect for him. So it's good, it's refreshing to hear what you guys do and how you approach it. It's a cool concept.
Thank you.
Keep doing it. Keep doing what you're doing, and I appreciate your commitment to it and the quality of it, and we're happy to be here.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, Joppa just kind of summed it up. For my part, I love feedback. I love discussion. One of the things that I do a lot of for our team is I interface with the community, trying to. Our community is at its best when they're talking about these concepts and about how things could be, or what are the potential pitfalls. The more of that kind of honest and objective feedback that we can get, the better a game we can make. And so keep doing what you're doing. Keep driving these discussions. It's awesome stuff. We love it.
Thanks.
Good stuff. Well, thank you guys for coming on. We very much appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you both.
All right, have a good night.
Yeah, thank you.
So there you have it, folks. The interview with Neph and Joppa regarding crafting and kind of where things are, their thoughts on where things are going, and a couple little nuggets in there that I thought were super interesting.
Yes. Since we're so new to this, some part of me doesn't... I don't know if what we're hearing is new and to everyone else it's old, but it sure sounded new to me, so I was happy with how that turned out. Again,
I was most interested in the whole boss mobs having their own kind of disposition.
Yes,
that's cool.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's going to be a lot to think about. There's going to be a lot to unpack as we go from here. So we've got some more topics to add to our list, our growing list of things to talk about. But thank you again. I can't even begin to say how thankful we are. Especially given we're a brand new channel, we're just getting started. I think around now we're
just hit 100 subs.
Just hit 100, right?
Woohoo!
That's nothing. But these guys made time to hang out with us, and I think that is incredible. Usually, they have a limited amount of time. They want to make the biggest bang for their buck when they do go give an interview. It's the fact that they hung out with us, Joppa and Nephele. We very much appreciate. I can't even tell you how thankful we are. And we promise we'll be nice with our reviews in future.
Right.
Even though they said no, be I'm just kidding, of course. We'll be mean.
Yeah, being critical is okay as long as it's constructive criticism. I appreciate the fact that they like that. So.
Yes, absolutely. And we hope, I'm glad that that's how they took it, because I was going back through our discussion that we had previously, right? Looking at the developer build, or thinking, were we unnecessarily mean in any of that? But, I think there was a comment or two Joppa took to heart. You can tell,
right?
But
oh yeah, he mentioned the torches into the face. So yes, he obviously pays attention, which I love. So
yeah, absolutely. So
anyway, let's move on. This week's last Comquest, I should say, was in regards to cash shops and what was the highest amount you've ever spent at a cash shop. And I know that you folks out there have spent more than $25 on a cash shop, but Michael Pate was the only one that was gutsy enough to actually post something.
Yes.
So, Michael, congratulations, you are the Comquest winner.
Yes, very much.
For this week, we wanted to stay on topic with our Comquest and basically give us your most creative 4-ingredient recipe for a food item in Pantheon. Like, you can use real-world stuff, fantasy stuff, whatever, as long as it's 4 items or less.
Whatever you want. Come up with something hilarious or something,
Exactly. Hobbit
whatever.
stew, 2 hobbits, some apples, and some beer.
Right.
There you go. 4 ingredients.
Let's entertain each other.
Exactly. So, obviously, the most creative answer and the one that makes Sechari laugh the most is going to win and get pinned.
Fair enough.
Check us out on Facebook.com/Disparate Worlds. On Twitter, we are at Disparate Worlds, and our website is disparateworlds.org. In addition, on our website and in the description below is a link to our Discord. Please, please, please join us there.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for joining us for this very long episode. It was a blast. Very much enjoyed having you with us and watching. Do drop a comment, do the whole like and subscribe thing. That's always appreciated. The notification bell will also let you know when new episodes come out so that you don't miss them, so highly recommended. all of that said, take care of yourselves, friends. Remember always to be immovable in your principles and irresistible in your passion.